Let's talk about President Kennedy. We mentioned him briefly in a previous lecture, but today we're going to talk about his short presidential term. He was president from 1960 when he was elected until 1963 when he was assassinated in the streets of Dallas. Our essential question is, what domestic and foreign issues was Kennedy forced to face during his short presidential term? The 1960 election. The 1960 presidential election marked the first time the major candidates debated each other on national television. John F. Kennedy narrowly defeated Richard Nixon and became the youngest man ever elected to the presidency. In his inaugural address, Kennedy challenged Americans to ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. His speech sought to ignite the spirit of American idealism. Domestic policy under President Kennedy. Kennedy's new frontier symbolized the vigor of youth. The president and his wife, Jackie, brought an elegant style to the White House. Kennedy sought to use the powers of the federal government to solve the nation's problems. He proposed a tax cut to stimulate the economy, the creation of Medicare, civil rights legislation, and increased aid to education. None of these proposals, however, passed under Kennedy. However, he did create the Peace Corps, a program in which American volunteers went to developing countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America to share their skills, and we still do have a Peace Corps today. The space race. To counter the Soviet space program, President Kennedy announced that America would place a man on the moon. In 1962, John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth. Few Americans at that time realized that they were just setting off on a road of exploration and discovery that would greatly improve their lives on Earth. Later presidents continued the space program, and by 1969, the United States became the first country to land two men, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, on the surface of the moon. Space exploration has led to advances in technology that have improved the quality of our lives. For example, as a result of space exploration, we now have satellites with improved television and radio signals. These satellites help us communicate faster, predict the weather, and forecast impending tsunamis, cyclones, hurricanes, and tornadoes. They also allow us to make telephone calls overseas and to use GPS. The space program also has led to the invention of high-performance solar cells, new lubricants, infrared ear thermometers, enriched baby food, cordless power drills, and Tempur-Pedic foam for mattresses and pillows. Kennedy's foreign policy. Like Truman, Eisenhower before him, President Kennedy staunchly opposed communism and pledged to contain it. One of the greatest challenges Kennedy faced was in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. In 1959, while Eisenhower was still president, Fidel Castro led an uprising to overthrow the brutal Cuban dictator General Bautista. At first, Americans looked at Castro's revolution as an attempt to introduce democracy for Cuba. However, shortly after taking power, Castro made new agreements with the Soviet Union. President Eisenhower reduced the amount of sugar Cuba could sell to the United States, and Castro nationalized American businesses in Cuba. Then he announced his plan to make Cuba a pro-Soviet communist nation. Land holding was limited, and any opponents were thrown in prison. The Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. President Eisenhower approved a plan to overthrow Castro. This included secretly training a group of Cuban exiles in the United States and in Guatemala to prepare to invade the island. When Kennedy became president, he let the plan continue, but he did refuse to provide air power, which would openly tie the invasion to the United States. The exiles landed in Cuba 3 months after Kennedy took office, but were quickly defeated by the Cuban military. This was a very embarrassing foreign policy failure for President Kennedy. The Alliance for Progress, also in 1961. To meet the communist challenge, Kennedy created a program of grants and loans to Latin American nations to promote economic progress, land reform, and trade. The Berlin Wall, 1961. A few months after the Bay of Pigs failure, President Kennedy met Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev face-to-face in Vienna. Kennedy did not feel the meeting went well. Only a few weeks after that, Soviet officials actually began construction of the Berlin Wall, cutting off access to the West for East Berliners. 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The exiles invading the Bay of Pigs had been instructed to say they were acting independently, but they disobeyed their orders. Castro and Khrushchev became aware that the United States had been behind the invasion and took steps to protect Cuba. In 1962, U.S. spy planes flying over Cuba discovered that Cuba was secretly preparing silos for missiles with nuclear warheads. At this time, Soviet missiles still could not reach the United States easily from Europe or Asia. Now, they would be able to launch missiles from only 90 miles away. President Kennedy was determined to prevent this from happening. But how could he stop them without causing a nuclear war? In October of 1962, Kennedy gathered a group of his top officials to form a special committee at the White House. He encouraged them to consider every option to find a way out of this crisis. In good decision making, one examines all the alternatives and weighs the pros and cons. Some urged an immediate strike on the missile silos. After a week of intense debate, Kennedy decided to announce a naval blockade around Cuba to prevent the arrival of any additional Soviet weapons. One Soviet ship was actually stopped and boarded. Kennedy also threatened to invade Cuba if the offensive missiles were not withdrawn. How would Khrushchev react? Kennedy put U.S. armed forces at their highest state of alert, while Soviet commanders in Cuba prepared to defend their island. For a brief moment, the Cuban Missile Crisis became the closest the world has ever come to a nuclear war. After several days of extreme tension, Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles for a pledge that the United States would not invade Cuba. Kennedy also agreed to pull U.S. missiles out of Turkey. After the Cuban crisis, U.S. and Soviet leaders set up a special hotline telephone. They also agreed to a treaty banning further nuclear testing except for underground.